Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation regarding plant reproduction processes and their functions in nature. My name is Jared Small, and today we're going to be overlooking the processes involved with plant reproduction, their functions in nature, and their overall effects on the ecosystem. Without further ado, let's get into it. Plant reproduction types can be organized into four basic categories, each of these reproducing in either a sexual or asexual variation. These include angiosperms, gymnosperms, and seedless non-vascular plants and seedless vascular plants. What is effectively known but not very well researched is how common it is with plant life that the genetic option to reproduce, either sexually or asexually, typically define the characteristics of how the plant looks, develops, grows, and achieves genetic diversity with its habitats. Today, that's what we're going to be looking into. And the first plant reproduction type that we're going to be looking into are the angiosperms. Angiosperms are typically defined as flowering plants. These are, as the name implies, plants with flowers. They grow flowers to attract pollinators that transport pollen to their counterparts, or they have certain organs that inside their plant that allow them to transport pollen and also receive pollen in order to basically fertilize the seeds and allow the seed to be protected and then drop and then germinate and grow into another plant. But what is interesting about this is the way that these plants can develop into fruits and vegetables. Now, a lot of times whenever a plant is fertilized in this way, there is the stamen. Here we have a diagram of the angiosperm reproduction cycle. Here we have different parts of the reproductive organs. Here we have the ovary and the stamen. And the stamen essentially releases the pollen, which holds the sperm cells. This is transported via air or by some other organism that interacts with the plant, and that transports the pollen to another flower, to an ovary, and that releases the sperm down into the ovary, into the ovules. And we'll be going into the genetic aspects and physical aspects of how this occurs later, but right now we're just going to be talking about how this affects fruits. Now once the seed is... I'm sorry for going back and forth, but that's just the way it is. Once these ovules are fertilized and become seeds and start germinating, typically in a fruit or vegetable producing plant, the ovary will grow and become a fruit, essentially a shield, to protect the fertilized seeds, which would, in regular terms, be eaten by a plant, by another animal or predator of some sort that would essentially try to hinder the plant's reproductive properties. But by doing this, it essentially protects the seeds. Now, what's interesting is that the sexual reproductive organs on these angiosperm plants, some have male reproductive organs, some have female reproductive organs, since the species is so diverse. But the reproductive process is essentially the same. You have the stamen, as I was talking about, and this ovary, or the female reproduction organ, which I'm sorry I didn't name. Before it's called a carpel. We have the stamen here, which releases a mother spore, which divides via meiosis, which is essentially a process of cellular or chromosome division, which helps with genetic diversity, and then mitosis, which separates, creating a generative cell and a tube cell. This tube cell essentially grows into a tube, which transports the generative cell, which splits into two sperm cells, and this fertilizes the egg cell, or the ovary, down inside the ovule, down inside the ovary, and fertilizes the seed that becomes a plant once the plant dies, and then the seed is released down into the soil. The next plant reproduction type that we're going to be looking at are gymnosperms. Now, these are essentially plants with cones, and they consist mostly of pine trees. They reproduce essentially the same as angiosperms, but the way they reproduce is interesting. The reproductive organs of pine trees are situated in the cones. The male reproductive cones are up at the top of the tree, and they release pollen, which is caught by the air and transports it long distances, and the female cones are stuck on the bottom. And this is how This is the plant reproduction cycle of a pine tree. Essentially, it's the same way as an angiosperm. There's a mother cell which divides meiosis. There's a mitosis pollen cell which divides and becomes a generative and tube cell. This enters into the female comb, which is essentially a big ovary, enters into the seed, and then germinates the cell. The next plant reproduction type that we're going to be talking about is cellulose non-vascular plant reproduction types. These plants essentially reproduce via water, and that is the unique characteristic about them. They are separated into both male and female versions. There are no versions that have both male and female organs, and these plants reproduce by water. The male version releases the sperm cell out into the water, then it becomes attached to a female version of the plant. It enters into the female plant, fertilizes an egg. That egg becomes an embryo. The embryo grows, and then the embryo rises into the water and then breaks through the top of the water line, breaks above the water, and then it releases spore cells. And if these spore cells interact with water, then they'll grow and become a new plant. The next plant reproduction type that we're going to be talking about are cellulose vascular plant reproductive types. Now, these plant reproductive types are interesting because it's essentially one of a few plants that reproduce asexually. These plants have spores on the bottom of the leaves, which, when released, have both male and female reproductive organs inside of them, and if the conditions are right when they land, the male reproductive organ will impregnate the female reproductive organ in essentially the same way that a angiosperm reproductive process works. The sperm cell will impregnate the seed, and then that seed will grow into a new plant, essentially like a new fern in that area. Now, we've gone over a lot of information, so let's stop and think. What do all these plants have in common? They all essentially work and process and help the environment. They all create oxygen. They all take in sunlight. They all provide nutrients to the soil, and they all work together within the Thyatira pyramid. But what happens when these are removed, and that these Thyatira pyramid essentially collapses, and that takes me to my next slide, and called invasive species. Now, invasive species are basically species that come from another environment that aren't native, and these can actually hurt species because it interacts with the processes of these reproductive processes, rather. And what happens when these reproductive processes are interrupted is that these plants can't reproduce as effectively, and they basically die. So, next time you go outside, what do you think you're going to think when you look at plants? I hope you all enjoyed my video, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.